I'm very pleased to welcome everyone. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge our host, Solvay Brussels School, and in particular, Mikhail Castaneda, who's done a remarkable job of organising today's event. Not perhaps getting it to start on time, but nevertheless. He has the support of a great team, which I'm sure he'll acknowledge by name during the day. Today's event is one of an ongoing series organised by Solvay in conjunction with the Georgetown University Global Economic Challenge Network. And today it's also sponsored by the CEPR in London, and it benefits from the support of different science foundations of Belgium, the FNRS, the EOS, and the BELSPO. The Georgetown Global Economic Challenge Network is an initiative of the Georgetown University's President Office, and its endeavour is to bring together leading academics and policymakers to discuss a number of important policy issues. So far, we've had events in Brussels, Melbourne, Paris, Sao Paulo, Madrid on topics including the future of work, ageing and retirement, labour market formality, and the challenges of the digital age. We've also had many online events, the dangers of populism, the decreasing trust in institutions, immigration and refugee assimilation, and the economic implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For anyone who's interested in those events, you can watch the recordings on YouTube if you go to our website. Today's event is on various issues related to inequality, and we're delighted to have really an extraordinary list of speakers. The conference will have two separate components, which are strongly related. The first will be a presentation of 3 academic papers, and the second part will be a policy discussion moderated by Mikhail. Before we start, I'd like to thank Luigi and Chinwe especially. I'd like to thank all the speakers, but those who came long distances. I can understand firsthand the challenges of being away from home and making these trips over a very short period, so we're all very, very grateful. I'm also very grateful to Solvay and Mikhail. They've been very active participants of the network since its inception, and they're a large part of the reason it's been such a success. Anyway, so on that, I would like to start with the first speaker, Chinwe Jun from University of Houston. And can you see the title? I can't see the title of the talk. And then I'll leave 10 minutes of discussion at the end. But if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask during the presentation.
Thank you so much. Labor supply, labor force participation, employment. Currently now they're like 47% of the labor force, the prime age labor force. In terms of full-time full year, which means that you work 50 weeks and full-time, they're actually 44% of the labor force. So in terms of this aspect of the labor market output, women have really arrived. They are really part of the labor force. And many of us know that they actually surpass men in terms of human capital accumulation and education. So you can sort of look at many dimensions of education, and they have actually done better than men. So that's like BAs, MAs, etc. But in terms of wages, though, there's still a persistent wage gap. So let me just sort of share with you a graph like this. So this is looking at sort of 2 groups. One is men and women with less than college, and the other are college graduates. particularly among college graduates. So this is the ratio of female to male wage or full-time full-year earnings. And particularly for college graduates, there has been a slowdown since 1990. So if you sort of took an average of these two groups, there is an increase even in the 1990s, but it's going to be at a much slower rate since the 1990s. And those of us who work on gender have sort of struggled with this thought that on so many dimensions, women have caught up or even surpassed men, but in terms of wages, there appears to be this slowdown or stalling. So there's a rich literature that looks at selection in the following sense. So the idea is the extent to which women are present in the labor market in terms of labor force participation will have an impact in terms of the observed wages that you see, right? So, of course, Jim Heckman has made a career out of this sort of selection issue. But maybe there are a couple of papers that I want to bring to your attention. I don't know how to get rid of the chat. Bring to your attention that which you may not be as familiar with. So Claudia Goldin, our recent Nobel Prize winner, has a lovely paper on the extent to which newly entering women with very low levels of labor market experience could actually depress the observed wages of working women, right? So there was sort of a compositional change in terms of which women are working, where you could actually see that the observed wages are actually depressed for that reason. Now, my colleague, Yona Rubinstein, has another paper that sort of is the opposite, where during the 1980s, when there was a rapid increase in the skill premium, you actually had the entry of very highly talented women into the labor force, and that increasing the observed wages, the wages that you actually measure among working women. So what we're doing in this paper is sort of along those lines of how sort of the different ways that women and men work impact, sort of has a feedback effect on the observed wages. And the margin that we're looking at is not so much the extensive margin, the labor force participation rate, but what we sort of coin as the intensive margin, which is what are the jobs that working men and women, and in our case, we're going to be looking at full-time working men and women, what are the jobs that they take? And that in itself could impact the observed wages of men and women. So we're going to be, in this paper, looking at this sort of occupation or selection into jobs and how that impacts wages. So what we're doing is that we are going to be looking at occupations, or I guess jobs in this framework, and thinking about what are the task requirements on the job or the occupation and the time requirements on the job. And then what is the impact of those requirements related to the job in terms of men and women sorting into those jobs. And as a result, what impact that has on pay. And the key insight here is, looking at the second bullet, what we argue is that there are tasks or non-routine cognitive tasks that actually require not only cognitive ability, but also certain types of labor supply or hours. And here we draw on the insight from a well-known paper by David Autor, who many years ago sort of started this whole literature and coined the phrase routine and non-routine tasks. And the insight there, when he talked about it, was in reference to computers, but he thought of routine tasks, or he defined routine tasks as those types of tasks where you could actually think about codifying it into a set of instructions. And once you sort of, the job or the task that you do can be codified in that way, you could actually think about sort of having a substitute come in and doing the work. He was talking about how computers could actually sort of do the task because these tasks could be codified. And those are sort of the routine tasks. So here I think we sort of have a similar insight, which is, by definition, the non-routine tasks are all the things that cannot be codified into a set of instructions so that if you had to leave, somebody else could take over, right? So these non-routine tasks are going to require you to sort of finish the task rather than having somebody else be able to substitute for you. So what would that mean is that, like, think about trial lawyers. If you're sort of on trial and you had certain tasks that you had to accomplish that are associated with that, you couldn't just sort of say, okay, I need to go. Why doesn't somebody else take over for me? So you become sort of irreplaceable. And so a lot of the time, these types of jobs and tasks are going to require you to be there, sometimes working long hours. So that's the kind of phenomenon that we're sort of thinking about. So there are a lot of these non-routine cognitive tasks that are going to require that type of labor supply or hours to go along with it. And so our argument is going to be that because of the still sort of persistent gender norms, and women by far still take most of the household and childcare responsibilities, there are going to, due to these hours requirements, they're actually going to be underrepresented in these abstract tasks, and then they're actually overrepresented in the more routine tasks. Okay, so this is sort of the intensive sorting across jobs that we want to highlight. And what we want to argue is that this mismatch of sort of their talents to the types of jobs is actually going to contribute further to the gender wage gap. So yeah, I think it would be really interesting to see to what extent the ability to work from home would sort of mitigate these. So I think that still needs to be sort of further thought of, but you can imagine that you had a very important client meeting, and before it had to be face to face, and now to some extent maybe you can have that meeting on Zoom, right? So it might mitigate these forces, but there will also be other types of. I mean, I could tell a trial lawyer for sure you wouldn't be able to do that. And then you might argue a lot of businesses, if you're generating clients and making business, a lot of that requires travel and face-to-face, right? So it's probably still, part of it is going to persist. Okay. All right, so we are going to be contributing to this well-known task literature. And what is different here is that we're going to talk about, so in the task literature, there is a matching between workers and tasks, but it's usually on ability or their cognitive ability. So usually it's the ones that are have high cognitive ability are matched to these non-routine demanding tasks. And what we're bringing here is the notion of the sort of labor supply or the hours requirement that goes along with the performance of the task. And that's going to have different implications for who sorts into those tasks, and particularly when you're thinking about gender. There's a large literature that we're related to, which is on the flexible work schedule literature. And this is, Claudia Golden's work. She had her famous Ely lecture in 2014 sort of discussed this phenomenon of jobs that require long hours or overwork. Now, you might sort of say, well, okay, that sounds very familiar. The story you're telling seems very similar to that whole story of overwork. And I just want to say, what is it that is different here relative to the previous sort of literature here? And the idea is that in the previous work, the argument was within certain skilled occupations, there are these jobs distinguishing long hours versus not, and women don't go into those long hours. What we're saying is that because of those long hours, women actually sort into less skilled occupations. So here we're really directly sort of addressing the trade-off between the complexity of the task you do and the hours that you are willing or not willing to apply. So there's actually, they do less than they could. There's sort of lack of working to your capacity, which is the mismatch that we're talking
the US, like you consider different working culture, Denmark, 3, 4 o'clock, everybody, and so you expect that?
Yeah,
I mean,
no,
you haven't mentioned what data set that you're using. But I assume.
Yes, it is US. But I think one of the things that I am really sort of excited about doing, looking at other, but I gotta say the US is sort of a leader, right? So we sort of started this whole thing about everybody working hard and returns to skill going up. Eventually Europe catches up, right? So now I don't know about Denmark, but you know, I think Germany's caught up in terms of rising. Everybody's sort of following that model. The terms of skill go up, people work longer hours. We can have a discussion about whether that's true or not. But I think one of the comments that I get, and it'll be sort of maybe even more obvious as I keep talking, is that people said, you know, to what extent is this sort of hours requirement along with in these jobs, is that like convention and the way society organized how we work and arrange how we work, or is it really something very fundamental in terms of the production function? And I'm sort of arguing here like it's a production function parameter that the, you know, non-routine tasks go along with these types of hours. But we could have, I think there's room for discussion. To what extent is that like a hard sort of wired production function? How society sort of arranged? Probably a little bit of both. Okay, so I don't know how much detail I should go into. I think that to the extent that you want detail, I'm ready to sort of provide you with detail. But a lot of you are probably already familiar with the task requirements, right? So there's sort of different versions of it. The original version of the auto-leading Ornate paper was EOT, or the Dictionary of Titles. And basically what they do is they sort of have detailed occupations, like 300 some occupations, and they score each occupation. Well, not they, but the ELS did way back then. They score occupations in terms of what are the requirements, the task requirements. So, you know, these are the usual sort of non-routine, analytical, associated math. There is direction controlled planning. We're going to average the first two and call that the non-routine abstract task requirement. Then there's like manual, then there's more routine, right? So we have 3 categories: non-routine, abstract, routine, and then manual. And then the time requirements are a little bit not as standard, but the measure we're going to use is this long hours measure. It's actually by occupation. These previous papers have looked at what fraction of men work more than 50 hours in that occupation. We're going to take that share of men working more than 50 hours, and then we're going to standardize it so that it's like a 0, 1 variable. And then there's an alternative. You might say, well, that doesn't seem like that's actually a requirement of the job. It's actually sort of an equilibrium outcome. So if you're not happy with that measure, you also do a robustness with a different measure that's more like the DOT or the ONET, which is more an attempt to get at what is required on the job. And Claudia Golden introduced this sort of measure of flexibility, which is associated with the sort of time requirements. So we have a robustness. Okay, so let me go through the various sort of steps or the bullets of the argument that I got. The first is to show you that very positive or tight correlation between the task requirements, the non-routine task requirement, and the hours requirement. So this is a graph. So just looking at the left panel, imagine there are like 365 dots, which we are not showing. So each dot is like a detailed occupation category. And there's sort of two scores that we're looking at. One is the hours requirement, and the other is a non-routine task requirement. And then we just run a linear regression through those 365 dots. So the positive slope is the abstract non-routine task and how that correlates with the hours requirement. Right? So it's very sort of highly positively correlated. On the other hand, the routine task requirement is negatively correlated with the hours requirement. So the right-hand panel, I do the non-routine again because it's worth showing twice. But the other is the manual. So the manual task requirement doesn't really have a very strong relationship with the hours requirement. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes. And then if you sort of prefer looking at the numbers, the 0.492, that's the correlation with the abstract task and long hours. And then the minus 389 is a negative correlation with routine task. And so below are the various rows. This is the Claudia Golden sort of ONET-based measure, right? And if you sort of take the 5 categories and you create an index, that is the very last row, the ONET index. And here, basically, I'm showing you, it doesn't matter. You could use this very different type of measure, and it's very strongly positively correlated with abstract. So this would be like measure of inflexibility or the sort of time requirements that really require you to be there. The only one that doesn't really work is time pressure. The other one sort of line up. So first I'm showing you that there is a positive relationship between hours and task requirements. Now I want to show you that women are behind, or there's a gap in women going into occupation with the non-routine abstract task requirement. Okay, so I'm going to call this sort of differential sorting. I have to do a little bit of work in terms of describing what the pictures that you're going to see. So what we do is we're going to describe, this isn't really like a regression, it's more like a description, a way to describe the sorting. So think about a worker I in an occupation J. So there's a match between worker and the occupation. Right? So there's an IJ match. And what we're going to do is that we're going to describe this IJ match. What is a match? Well, you can describe something about the occupation, which are the Z's. So those are the tasks. So we could say, is this abstract non-routine task? What is the score for this occupation based on in terms of that? So there's these task requirements C, and then we could say, or we could sort of say something about the worker I. So those are the exits. So they could be like education, age, race. And then basically what we want to project or predict is if when we see this IJ match, there's certain sort of descriptions about the job, certain descriptions of the worker, what is the prediction that that worker will be female, right? So it's a way to sort of look at the female share in a particular occupation, controlling for individual level characteristics, as well as something about the job. Okay, so that's what you're going to be seeing. And I want to sort of highlight the blue, which is the one that we're in, well, both blue and the green, right? So this would be, how would you interpret it? So basically a standard deviation increase in the abstract task measure, right, leads to, in the beginning, it was something like minus 8 percentage points, fewer females for every standard deviation increase in the abstract task. And then over time, so I'm showing you what happens at different points in time. Over time, women made progress, right? So they went more into the abstract tasks, right? So 0 would be parity with men, right? Now, but what happened in 1990, though, there's still a stall or stop in terms of progress, right? And since 1990, there really hasn't been. So they're about sort of 5 percentage points lower in these tasks relative to men with sort of the same characteristics. On the other hand, the green line says they're overrepresented in the routine tasks, right? And in the manual, the orange, women are never in. They're really, really underrepresented in manual tasks, which is not surprising, right? So the main point here is that they're overrepresented in routine, underrepresented in abstract. Are there any questions? Okay, so this picture on the left is exactly what I showed you in the earlier picture, right? But now I'm just sort of looking at routine and abstract, right? So routine is the top and abstract is the bottom. Now, what is going on the right-hand side is what happens if you did the same regression right here, the same regression, but then you actually control for the hours in the occupation as well, right? So it's the same thing, except we added in this additional control, which is the hours requirement. And what happens is that actually the gap between the two goes away once you control for hours, right? So this says that hours has a big part of explaining what is the reason that women are still behind in terms of the abstract task requirement. Now, we're going to do the same thing now with the NLSY. So before we were using the ACS/census because we wanted to sort of chart what happens over time. Here, we're just going to collapse or pool all the years of the NLSY data. So this is both the 79 and the 97. So roughly speaking, in terms of what time period we're looking at, it's going to be 1985 on, right? So we're going to sort of pool the data. Now, why are we doing the NLSY after all that? So the advantage of the NLSY is that it has these sort of pre-market skills in the data, right? So education is great, but we want to sort of think about worker skills even aside from education, right? Yes.
I'm trying to understand if there is a link with home production, or with child human capital investments that prevent women from having these long hours. So there seems to be this idea in the background, but I haven't seen it.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah. You're going to go back to that?
Yeah, so I don't know quite what you want me to do, but if there's time, I will show you that it's very much related to parental status, whether you have children or not. So it sounds like there's a demand for that. Okay. All right, definitely, I'll do that. So we're going to do this NLSY 7997 because the advantage here is that we have a measure of sort of pre-market skills, which is the AFQT. So let me just quickly go to the results. Oops. Thank you. Which is, I just want to show you that these numbers are familiar to what you've already seen, right? So the first say the first column, there's a number like -49, like the 5 percentage point gap, right? So in the NLSY, it's actually remarkably similar to what we found in the previous sort of ACS census, right? So in terms of the abstract task, women are about 5 percentage points behind, right? So that's sort of the baseline that we saw before. And then you can do various things. So one thing you can do is you can sort of throw in the worker skills, right? You can like controlling for it. And that actually doesn't really, it makes it a little bit different, but it doesn't really help that much. What really makes a difference, as you saw before, is when you include like the long hours measures at the occupational level, right? So these are not individual long hours. This is sort of the occupational level long hours. And you throw in that as control, and then you see that abstract task coefficient just sort of disappears. And then, but the other thing is that when you control for it, to sort of put in the worker skills as control, it wasn't doing too much. But what you really kind of want to do is you want an interaction, right? Instead of just a control. So what if you sort of said, well, let's see if there is a differential effect for low AFQT or low sort of cognitive skill people versus higher. So we just sort of cut the data in terms of below and above AFQT score. And the point here, I think, is that it's really a much more pronounced phenomenon that's sort of there being a gap in the abstract task score among the higher AFQT. So it's really the skilled women that are going to be, that are behind in terms of this gap. Okay, so following Luigi's ask, I'm going to show you. So imagine doing the same sorting equation, but now you are sort of breaking, not by like high or low AFQT, but by various measures of parental status, right? So one way you can measure this is to say something like, well, so remember we have a panel, so we can sort of look over the entire life cycle, whether a person is a parent or not. So you could sort of construct this ever parent measure dummy, right? So that's the parent dummy. Okay. Well, I can't quite see. Okay. All right. So, and that sort of gets at like the selection of people, like who are parents and what is the effect. So when you put that in, actually, so that's going from column 1 to column 2, you put in this sort of ever parent dummy, right? So it's definitely a phenomenon with parents because it's the interaction of parent and abstract, right? I mean, the coefficient minus 0.011 is people who are never parent, right? So it's negative, right? But it's not really strong or significant, right? So that's sort of saying, is there something about women, even sort of among single women and single men, there is a differential effect. So that might say, well, women don't like to be in these abstract tasks because they don't like to work these incredible, crazy, stressful hours, right? So is it something about being a woman? It doesn't really appear to be the case, right? But it really kicks in for parents, right? But even more than that, there's another way to think about parenthood, which is not whether you are ever a parent, but are you currently a parent, right? So current parental status. So basically this after measure is, which can sort of look at you over your life cycle and say, oh, it turns on to 1, right? If you are currently a parent, right? So the minus 0.015 sort of looks at people who are both sort of never parents, also people who are eventually going to be parents, but currently they're not parents, right? So there's a little bit of more anticipation because it's a little more negative, but again, it's really current parental status that really sort of kicks in, right? So it definitely, women are behind. It has definitely something to do with the child penalty and having children. And so the column 4 and 5, we put in all this sort of, again, the hours controls, and the coefficient basically goes away. Okay, so that's about being a parent. Okay, now let me go back. All right, so what are the implications on wages? So what we're going to do is something like an Oaxaca decomposition type of exercise, for those of you who are familiar with that. And the idea is I've sort of identified this occupational gap. Women are not in these abstract, non-routine tasks relative to men. And I want to know, like, what is the price of having that gap, right? And in the Oaxaca decomposition, typically what we do is we use the white males as sort of the unconstrained group, and we're going to price out various sort of characteristics using sort of their wage equation, right? So that's the idea. And so it's going to be like running a wage equation with all these things like task measures and skill measures. And what's going to be important for us is the interaction of skill and task, right? So what I want to show you is that there is a real big return. Those are the red box that's highlighted, right? So if you get higher wages if you're in an abstract task, you get actually higher wages if you're in a routine task, right? So part of the sort of task thing is that an occupation could actually score high on all measures. It's not really like, it doesn't have to sum up to one, right? But, and then cognitive is about the worker skill. So if you're cognitively able, that's the AFQT, you get a huge wage premium. Okay, these are all sort of white males. Now the interaction though is like really interesting, right? So if you are cognitively able, so high AFQT, and you work in an abstract task, you get this sort of added premium, right? But if you're cognitively able and you work in a routine task, actually there's sort of a penalty associated with that relative to, I mean, you're still going to get a premium because you're cognitively able, but actually being in a routine task kind of gets you a penalty. So there's this sort of this matching or returns to matching that the red box is highlighting. And we know that over time, this is now sort of looking over since 1990. So this data I'm looking at from 1990 on, right? So relative to the 70s and 80s, this interaction, this price has really increased, at least in the US. I don't know about other countries. I think so in other countries too, right? So it's really all about being highly skilled and being in a job that is demanding, that has the big return, right? So what I'm going to argue here is that even though women, remember, were about 5 percentage points behind and it was kind of steady, in terms of the price, that's actually getting more expensive, right? So the same gap could have like a higher sort of penalty over time because of the way these skill prices are moving, right? So it's going to have implications on the gender wage gap, okay? And this is sort of I'm sorry, I'm kind of rushing here at the last, but basically the unadjusted is the raw gap. And what happens is if you look at 1990, women are about 32 log points behind. In 2018, they're 17 percentage points behind, log points behind. So there has been improvement, right? So 18% is how much they gain over that period. Now, what's sort of the highlighted box? Well, actually, a lot of that gain is due to the fact that they're becoming more educated. Remember, women are sort of gaining in terms of education relative to men, right? So if you take that into account, their improvement has been much less, right? So it's been about 23% gain over this period, right? So what if you throw in our sort of tasks and the skills and the interaction of tasks and skills, right? You actually, sorry, you're actually able to explain about a third more, right? They actually gain more relative to the 23%, right? So they gain in terms of education, but if you take that into account, they didn't gain as much. If you take into account the fact that they're behind in terms of their occupation, and that is costly in this economy, then you can explain more of sort of the underlying gender gap. Okay, so I'm pretty much done. So our argument is that you have to consider jobs or occupations, not in terms of just the types of skills that are required, but also you might think that there are hours that are required with that. And due to those hours requirements, women are going to sort of sort less into those occupations. And that's going to, and it's going to be especially costly for the high AFQT or highly cognitively skilled women. And this mismatch of jobs to people's ability, particularly for women, is going to have costs that can explain sort of the stagnant gender wage gap. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have time for some questions. Oh. Okay, so I have a question.
Bring it on.
So the title of the talk was about inequality, but what you're looking at here is primarily differences in means. Have you thought about looking how these kind of things operate over the wage, how they operate differently over the different wage distributions for males and females?
Well, we had a little bit of that because we were sort of saying it's really going to kick in for the highly skilled, right? So I think a related idea is that women really sort of have this, not so much the glass ceiling, but it's really sort of about the variance, right? So women on average, particularly if we sort of look at less educated and college educated, women on average do well, but it's really going to be sort of the variance that's at the 90th percentile, women are going to be really hurting, right? So I think it really is about, you know, Larry Summers's famous talk on, you know, on average, women are about the same, but at the tails, the women are lacking, right? So this is sort of an attempt to explain sort of this, what is going on at the tail. And I think this way of thinking about it has the ability to explain that a little bit.
Well,
Thanks for the talk. So I'm in an internal debate with some of my colleagues at ULB. If these choices are preferences or norms, so can I conclude from your results that preferences of men and women about their job are different? And because of that, we will see that there's always a gender wage gap because you do different, genders do different jobs. Can I use this as an argument?
Yeah, I don't know, preferences and norms.
No.
I would say they're
Let's forget about the norms, but the preferences. So can we conclude that there will always be a gender wage gap?
No, wait, I don't want you to say that they're sort of preferences like biological preferences. I think they're preferences that are driven by norms. And the norms are something that's very slowly evolving over time, right? So we're still at the stage where these norms are still very much binding, but I don't think it is sort of preferences that are biological, right? So I think they will evolve because this is sort of a costly misallocation for women. And so over time, I think.
At some point that for families or families without kids or singles with or without kids that I don't remember, that you observe similar effects. So
no, they were much less,
okay.
Much less, right?
But
so they
still,
were slightly negative and not significant, right? So yeah, no, I think that having children, I think is going to lead to a wage penalty, right? But I don't think it's going to be like a female associated penalty over time. I don't know if it's going to be 50 years or 60 years or, right? But still, I think these norms are still very strong.
we keep on debating then.
No, I think it's norms. Yeah. Any other questions?
any other questions? Great. Okay. Well, we're right on time then, right? Very good. Thank you. The next presentation will be from Paula Golby from ULB, and she's going to be talking about inheritance, demographics, and economic development. So we'll do the same thing. We'll go for a presentation for 50 minutes, so maybe speak for 40 minutes, and then if anyone has any questions, as we did in the previous one, just raise their hand, but wait for the mic if you can do.
Okay. So thank you very much for including me in the program. I'm very happy to be here and sharing some of my work, which are part of like a broad research agenda of mine, funded by the ERC, by an ERC starting grant and entitled Inheritance, Demographics and Economic Development. And the starting point of this agenda was to notice that in the literature of family economics, we had overseen the role played by inheritance, and in the literature on inheritance that focus on like how inheritance affects inequalities or physical capital accumulation, we have also overseen the role played by the demographics and how demographics adjust to different inheritance schemes. So inheritance matters at the individual, at the family, at the societal level. We have done research along these lines, but I think that the way inheritance and demographics are still yet to be explored more, and that's what I try to do. So there is a famous sociologist who in 1875, to give an example, clearly put up a thesis on how inheritance rules and family structures were meant to go together. And mainly he was arguing that the fact that a society with more egalitarian inheritance rules was also a society in which all its members had an easier access to marriage, because inheritance helps in making the first sort of investment in forming a family. While on the contrary, a society that gives all the inheritance into one head, into one heir, these are societies that turn around the family head, the heir, who has as a task the role of maintaining the state as intact as possible, and also to continue the lineage of the family. Okay, so what I want to study is how inheritance rules affect other sides of the demographics. We can think that they affect marriage, as I told you. So if I have an inheritance, for me, it's easier to build up a household. It can ease up also financial constraints to migrate to get education in contexts where education is expensive. And I'll talk a lot on how it can also affect fertility decisions. So in order to study this, how inheritance rules affect demographics, we need to go to contexts in which you have variation in inheritance rules and also in demographics. So for that, I'll go back in time and look at Western Europe and also to sub-Saharan African countries. So like there are many ways people can regulate inheritance. And this is an example of the database that we have created with some co-authors for France, where we classify 10 different types of inheritance. So you can distinguish inheritance along many categories. So the blue and the red are mostly, the red are liberal or impartible or inegalitarian types of inheritance. The blue are more egalitarian or partible types of inheritance, where every heir has an equal share in the inheritance. But even within these two broad categories, you can find several different rules. For instance, in the blue areas, you have places that are under what we call strict partible inheritance, in which no matter how much donations I receive during the lifetime of my father, when he dies, I have to bring everything back to the common pot, and that will be then split up. But there are other systems, like the systems of options, where I have the choice of bringing it back, or say, I'm happy with what I've received and I leave you the rest to the rest of the heirs. Same for more like unequal type of inheritance schemes. You can think of primogenitor, ultimogenitor, unigenitor types of systems. And along these two broad categories, you can also think in terms of like whether women are included or women are excluded from inheritance. So for example, Normandy were a system of egalitarian inheritance, but the women were excluded from inheritance. They could only ask a bouquet de fleurs, some flowers for when they got married. While in the South, you had systems in which even if you were a woman, you could inherit if you were the firstborn. So there are many types of inheritance systems, which is very nice, both in the past and also today. If you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, we find, so this is only plotting impartible and partible, or egalitarian and egalitarian, but you see that how even today within countries, we still find a lot of variations in the continent. Okay, so the main question that I will address in this talk is, how do these rules affect demographics? And I will focus on fertility decisions and marital decisions, looking at historical Europe, mostly France and Belgium, which are the contexts for which we have recreated a database to look at inheritance rules, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where the data already exists. And then I will conclude the talk by kind of like having some exploratory graphs of how do these inheritance rules then affect nowadays the societies. What are the legacies of these inheritance rules? Okay, so some context. I'm looking at how inheritance affect demographics, but I'm not claiming that these inheritance rules are exogenous. They originate from some factors. And I think it's important to keep in mind how they originated from the start. So inheritance rules, both in Europe in the past and in Sub-Saharan Africa, are regulated by customary law, which is by definition a law that is non-written, and it's enforced by a customary judge or chief. Okay, so it's a formal law which is not written at the beginning. It got written down in most of the European countries. It has never been written down in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa, despite several trials to do that. Okay, so before the introduction of the civil code, most European countries were under customary law, which is very nice because these are by definition local laws in a series of aspects, including inheritance, which is what I'm interested in here now, but you can think of any aspect covered by a normal civil code. Are regulating these customary codes. And then, so a little bit surprising, to date, there, like at least before we started creating our maps, there were no digital maps of customary boundaries in any a national political entity in Europe. And before starting having inheritance map, we need maps of customary boundaries. So our first task is to provide that. And then for Sub-Saharan Africa, we're simply going to follow the map of Murdoch. Something that is different between past Europe and Africa is, in the context of Europe, customs were at the locality level. So I live in a place, then this is the custom that's going to be applied to me. While in Sub-Saharan Africa, then if I'm from one ethnicity, then the rule is ethnicity based, and therefore we'll use the Murdoch map, which has the boundaries at the ethnicity level, and that has been digitized by Nathan. Okay, so what are the main origins of the rules that are in customary law and hence inheritance law? So they come from three different things. The first is the origins of the settlers. If you're in France and you are from the north, you're more likely to have Germanic roots and therefore follow the rules of the Germanic tribes. If you are from the south, you're more likely to follow the rules that were used by the Burgundians or the Visigoths that were following Roman law. So these the rules of the first settlers in a territory will certainly have an impact on the rules in a given locality. Then, of course, as the tribe settles in a locality, then how the locality is, the geographical factors will affect the rules. And we see that inheritance rules are very much related to the geographic. So lands that are better somehow tend to associate more with practice of inheritance that are less equal, that are more towards protecting the land to be maintained as intact and as big as possible over and over. And then, of course, the local chief, or the institution of the local chief, if he's Muslim or Catholic, will also play a role. So these are the three, sources that will support then the rules, including the inheritance rules. So the first part of the project is about constructing maps for historical Europe, which ultimately what we want is maps of inheritance rules. But then, as I told you, inheritance rules were regulated by customary law. So before having maps of inheritance rules, we need maps of customary law, the boundaries of what were the boundaries of the customs. And before getting the map of the customs, we need a map of the judicial district to which a custom was related to. Okay, so none of this exists. So we need to go like several steps backwards before we get what we ultimately want. So this is the methodology that we have developed to get this map of inheritance for France, which was the first country that we tackled with Victor Gay and Margoni. And so we started from an atlas of the judicial districts that was created by this guy, Armand Brett, in 1904, using the list of all judicial districts that were in place in 1789. So at that time, that's when the General Estates call deputies, and they call it at the level of the judicial districts. So he, like this Armand Brett, recreates an atlas based on the lists of like where these deputies were coming from. Okay, so this is an example of his atlas. So these are scans from the atlas that is now located in the University of Chicago, which has the best resolution of the maps, and Victor scanned in a big scanner, high resolution type of scanner. So this is for the Généralité of Lille. So each color is one judicial district. So he manually vectorized everything using the current municipality boundaries of nowadays, and it gives this map as a result. So we have now our first primary units in order to now be able to match judicial districts to customs, okay? So every custom is related to one of these judicial districts, and now we can start making correspondence tables. So for the first third, we use the atlas of Armand Brett himself, who in the companion volumes, he describes every one of these judicial districts. But unluckily for us, Armand Brett dies before he achieves his masterpiece. He completes his masterpiece. So I call Victor, I say, look, give me more. He says, that's all I got. And we realize, oh, he couldn't complete it. So we then have to gather a bunch of other primary and secondary sources of information. The first one is this Coutumier Général by Bourdeau de Richebourg in 1724, which is kind of like a compendium of most of the customs of France before in the Ancien Régime. Okay, so based on this big book with all the customs, we can say, oh, we can read the custom of Normandy, and we can say, okay, all these little judicial districts can be assigned to the custom of Normandy. But then we rely on a bunch of other secondary sources, like this one, which is a history thesis that draws a map on the customary boundaries that we can overlay with our judicial district maps, and therefore assign to our judicial districts the name of one custom. So at the end, we have 141 customs in the territory of France in the Ancien Régime. So that's what the map looks like. So the South has commonly been known to be like the region of Roman law, of written law in France. That's why it has a different color. But basically, it was a region where you had both customary law and Roman law together. Basically, the Roman law was a suppletory law in case of the silence of the custom. So now that we have that, we can give to each of these customs an inheritance rule. And there are many ways, as I showed you in the first slide, there are many ways to kind of like put rules together, whether we call it partible, impartible, women are included or not. So just to show you examples of the primary sources. So this is the custom of Brittany, this is the custom of Normandy. For instance, here you see that the children and all the other heirs will partageront également. So they will split equally the inheritance, and they say including the girls. So this is a system in which you divide and women are included. While in Normandy, the girls cannot ask for any inheritance. It's specified. So we read all that and we make the classifications. And we can draw, for instance, this map is similar to the one I showed, but it's just like blue. So you have partible inheritance, impartible inheritance, and difference on whether women are included. So here you have places in which, even though it's impartible, women are included, while here it's partible and women are excluded from the inheritance. So these are the main maps that we will be using for like a bunch of sub-projects. So the first one, yes.
So if you are big landowners with lands in different parts of France with different rules, would the different rules apply differently, or they would be related to the where the person had the main residence? Or
related to where the
land.
Yes, but for the context that France before the revolution, we're talking about a country populated by small landowners. Okay, so like if you think of like what is your population, this case is very rare. We're not in Prussia or England. It's really like France, a country of very small landowners, which is important for the mechanism.
Do you know how closely were these conventions followed? And maybe the rule
Yeah.
was that they were not entitled to it, but because the neighbours were giving things legally, the others followed it.
Yes, so that's a forever ongoing question, I think, and there's a lot of debate in the historical literature of whether of these the relationship between the rule and the practice. So my starting answer is like these rules come from practice, right? And like they evolved through practice and could change over time until they got written down. When they get written down in the 15th century, then they're frozen, right? But until then, it's very rare to see a custom change. And basically because these inheritance rules depend very much on their geography. So it's very unlikely that you change to something else because this is a rule that is efficient somehow for your economy, for your local economy. So maybe there are deviations for sure. They're probably not 100% compliance, but I'm certain that it's not the opposite of the practice. It has to be the practice should follow these rules. Plus, there are strong authorities implementing the rules if you want to go ahead against them. Yeah.
No? Is it working? Yes. So one important thing to anticipate, because I've seen a few of our presentations, is the impact today is still enormous.
Well, enormous, hold on.
and therefore, it must have been quite respected centuries ago. Otherwise, it would just be non-significant.
I think that it will be respected where there is a logic for respecting such an unfair type of practice, in particular, where like you want to concentrate and like give everything to one child and like not to the rest. So there must be a good reason for doing that. So let me like now talk a little bit about how in these inheritance rules might affect fertility decisions. Okay, so as a general motivation, legal institutions have been very much overlooked in the literature that has studied fertility, and that's very clear in the recent literature review paper about fertility just published, and that specified that what are the main factors driving fertility. That's what we know very well. So it's growth, GDP per capita, as the economy asks for more skilled laborers, then there is a human capital, the returns to human capitals increase, and therefore within parents we start substituting quantity versus the quality that we invest in their children. Female education also plays an important role, and that's related to the higher opportunity cost faced by women as their labor opportunities increase. Then there are also other factors like child mortality and contraceptives, but none of them really explain two important fertility contexts, which is the first one is the fertility decline occurring in France in the 18th century, which was the first country to see a demographic transition, a fertility decline, and still it remains very much unexplained. So why? None of these factors that are kind of like the main ones put forward in the literature on fertility can't really explain the French case, which precedes any other modern economy in terms of like the demographic transition. And then the other, I think, important context of high fertility is sub-Saharan Africa. So recently, Céline Zipfel, in her job market paper, was said that even after controlling by the main factors affecting fertility, we still find that sub-Saharan African women have over a child more than the rest of the world. So why is that? So something that we're overlooking from, like in my opinion, is how legal institutions affect fertility decisions, and that's why I'm gonna explore in two papers, one that focus on the fertility decline in France and another in sub-Saharan Africa. So the question you should be asking now is like, okay, why should these inheritance rules affect my fertility decisions? So the reason here is very simple. That's why I'm not going to show you the model, because the only hypothesis you need to have in your mind is that land in an agricultural economy is an important factor of production and is subject to indivisibility constraints. So imagine, Luigi, you have this piece of land and you want to have 9 children. But if you have 9 children, this share of land that you should be transmitting to each of them is worth nothing. So that incentive will probably limit you from having these 9 children, and you'll end up with fewer amount in order to transmit something that is worth to your whatever number of children is optimal for you to decide. Okay, so that's the main reason that we have in mind for why these different inheritance rules might lead to different fertility decisions. Okay, so we have 2 testable, yeah.
You know, the Pride and Prejudice example, you keep having children until you get a boy.
Until I get a boy.
To keep it inside the family.
Yes, that's something we looked, and we didn't find really differences in terms of the gender of the last child. So, because the norm was, at least in France, was not that women would be completely excluded. If I only have women, one of them or like all of them would be the heirs anyways. So this gender discrimination was not so striking. But then we have 2 testable predictions in terms of like the first, which is the one. Yeah, Alexei.
Yes, Paula, I have a small question. Would a tendency of families to let some of their children go to monasteries or like, you know, more religious settings where they would let go maybe of their inheritance have an effect or not?
Probably yes, but I don't have the data for that. I always hear stories about one is the heir, one is sent to church, the other one is sent to the clergy, to the army. I think there's still a paper with real data to check that whether this is true, but could be. For the moment, I'm focusing on like the number of children and not what they do. And then, so like fertility is higher on the impartible inheritance. That's what I just told you. And then like this inheritance difference, this other testable prediction that we will test is that these differences only matter when land is an important factor of production. So like a place where labor is more intensive in the production than land, like in this context, inheritance shouldn't matter, right? So if what we really care is labor and not land, then the indivisibility constraint, which is associated to the factor of production land, is less relevant, and therefore, like the rules on how to split this land have less an effect on fertility decisions. Okay, so let's go to the first big paper that we have, and that it's on my website if you want to check the details of this, which asks the question of whether the inheritance reforms that occurred during the French Revolution might have been responsible for one factor contributing to the fertility decline in France. So this figure illustrates its decline. It's in the early times. So you have here years, here you have births, and here you have several measures to like measure fertility of women. The one that we will be using is the one by Louis Henry that I will explain you the data in detail, but like it's this one. But no matter the measurement, you see the same patterns. First is that fertility was already declining before like the French Revolution kicks in, okay? So, and that's something well known. The fertility for the transition in France starts in the mid 18th century. But then there is an acceleration along, like in the times when the revolutions are passing several reforms, and one of them is our inheritance reforms that harmonizes inheritance and enables every heir to have an equal share in the inheritance included the women. Okay, so the question here is, did this cause this acceleration in France? So one of interesting question that I think is like, why did they do it, right? So why all on a sudden revolutionaries wanted to change inheritance rules? These inheritance rules had been there for a very long time, for centuries, and all of a sudden they want to change. So the first, there are three answers. The first one are, of course, equality constraints that were like at the heart of the revolutionaries, and that's especially true in the year 1793. You read any one of the declarations of human rights and the citizen, and the one of 1793 is the only one that puts equality before any other principle. But then there was also a willingness to harmonize the country. France was a mess in terms of boundaries. You had like customary boundaries, you had religious boundaries, you had boundaries for different taxation schemes. So there was a willingness to harmonize everything. And Voltaire, like quoting Voltaire, he says like there are more than 140 customs in France that have force of law. A man who travels the country has to change custom as many times as he's changed, or he goes through a post horse, which is around 9 kilometers. So very often you had to change the rules as you moved into other countries. But the most important reason is this one, and that's what you read in the documents of the National Convention, which is that there was a threat by the fathers, angry fathers, of disinheriting children that would like to join the revolutionary armies. So like by abolishing the use of the testament, the revolutionaries were kind of like protecting these children that would like to join the revolutionary armies and whose father wouldn't allow them to do, and we use the testament as an army against them doing so. Okay, that was the real reason behind the revolutionaries' mind. So fertility concerns, they were completely absent, and this reform was very much unexpected. If you look at the Cahiers de doléances, which were these famous cahiers where the people of France were putting their complaints at the early stage of the revolutions, there's very little on changes in inheritance rules here. Okay, so we'll match the database on inheritance that I showed you at the beginning to individual level data on fertility. The first one is a well-known database by French demographer historians, the Enquête Louis Henry, which is well known for being of excellent quality. The second one is known for being of very bad quality. But I'll try to convince you with some twists and some cleaning, we can actually, it's a very useful database to study historical demographic features. Okay, so on both databases, what you need to know is that we have information on fertility at the individual level of the women. Okay, so the drawback of the Henry data is just that we have very good data, but we only have few points in the map of France. Okay, so in total we have 39 municipalities, while in the Jenny.com database we have a bunch more. Okay, so we'll start with the Jenny data using a simple difference in difference types of empirical analysis, and then we'll increase the analysis by regression discontinuity type. So the Jenny is just a crowdsourced type of database in which anyone can introduce his ancestors. Okay, and it's subject to many types of biases that we can talk about if you ask me. But since I have 10 minutes, I'll skip. So the main methodologies so we'll start with difference in difference, simple, and we'll compare municipalities that were affected by the reform with municipalities that stayed egalitarian all over the time across women of different ages. So basically women that were too old to change their fertility decisions and women that were younger. So basically our treatment variable would be a variable 0 to 25. So it's 0 if a woman who is 40 in 1793, the year when the reform passed down, and then it's 1 if I'm 39, it's 2 if I'm 38, and it's 25 if I'm 15. Okay, so this is a snapshot of our first, you can first kind of like a preliminary type of results. So here we plot completed fertility across importable places partible places, this is the cohort that is affected by the inheritance reform. And this line is our treatment variable. So what you see is very clear. So before the reform, you see that there was already a gap across the two inheritance systems. And this gap, which is about 0.7 children, stays constant until like the cohort starts being affected by the reform. Okay, so this is like some evidence for the parallel trends and assumptions, but like what you see here is that then there is a convergence in the fertility decisions of these women. And that's what we're exploiting. So this is results from a difference in different type of estimation where we regress fertility on a dummy variable for the municipalities that switch inheritance rule. So from impartible turned into partible, in another variable that is interacted with our treatment variable. What we see is that no matter the controls here we only are putting controls at the individual and the household level, and the results are very stable across the specification. So it includes controls for literacy, parents-in-law, whether they are alive or not, the accuracy of the data. But basically what we find is that, yes, so there is this pre-existing gap across the two systems of inheritance of about 0.7 children, but then like after the reform, like what these lines tell you is one more fertile year in a municipality that switch inheritance practice led to this decline in fertility. So if you multiply one of these numbers by 25, which is the whole time span fertile of a woman, you get a number which is around between 0.6 and 0.7, which is interesting because it closes the gap, the pre-existing gap that existed before the harmonization. Okay.
You think there's no anticipation effects here?
No, anticipation effects, no, because if there were, you should have seen that written in these complaint books, which are these cahiers de doléances, and none of them really mentions it. And so that was really a surprise, and there were a lot of protests by the people in the south of France, mainly that were mostly under impartible inheritance, claiming that how can we do this, because if by doing that we will kind of like completely destroy our patrimony. So this was really like the fear of the people after the implementation of this reform. So here we control in a flexible way to allow fertility to have different trends along several characteristics at the municipality level. So we can think of economic conditions characteristics, proxied by the price of wheat at the municipality level, or religiosity again at the municipality level, or distance to political institutions like the clergy or the centers for tax collections or the center of these judicial districts, which is where we would go to kind of like make the complaints. And also other geographic type of controls, like how far are we from a road or a distance postdoc. So none of this changes our coefficients. So this is what would have happened. We can use one of the models to see what would have happened to fertility in the absence of a reform, and our counterfactual would say that it would follow kind of like a smooth type of decline. So we can use like the Jenny.com to do the RDD, to kind of like on top of the difference in difference, implement our regression discontinuity. We can do either by splitting the sample in two, those that were not the cohorts that were not affected by reform, the cohorts that were affected by the reform. You see that at the border we have no effect here, while we did have the effect here. We can do something more fancy with like a full RDD interacted with our treatment. We find exactly the same thing. So no changes. So these results, no matter how we twist them, they're very robust. And we have 100 pages of robustness if you want to check that. So we find the same results. I mean, I don't have time to go through this paper, but like we find exactly the same result in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa. So for Sub-Saharan Africa, I told you that they are still under customary law. It's a context where you have legal pluralism. So you have either civil law with customary law, or common law with customary law together with Islamic type of law. So we use the ethnographic atlas merged with DHS. So this is a methodology. This type of data are very common in the literature. But so we'll also do an RDD comparing groups or ethnicities that are under one system of inheritance with ethnicities that are on another system of inheritance within a pair of groups within a country. So that's kind of like our spatial RDD type of identification strategy. And we find using a fuzzy RDD, because the discontinuity is given that we are in context of countries, people can move. And of course, like the discontinuity at the border is not perfect in terms of like the ethnicity that nowadays women are associated to. Then we find an average treatment effects, which is of the same order of magnitude to the one that we were finding in the French context. But what I think is novel, more novel in this paper compared to the previous one is like this second testable implication, which is like, do we see differences in terms of fertility? Do we see that inheritance rules affect fertility in places where labor intensity is very high compared to land incentive? And the answer is no. And we have two ways of proxying the labor intensity at the local level. One that is not very original is like we compare like flat versus steep terrains. The idea is that if you live here in a place where the terrain is very sloppy, you better need a lot of labor in order to feed your cattle or do the activities. So in these places, we find no differences in fertility across systems of inheritance. We have another more innovative type of way of proxying labor intensity, which is like the type of crops. We know that some crops are more labor intensive than some others. Like my grandfather would say that potato is for lazy people. And so like this is commonly acknowledged that cereals are more labor intensive than crops. So we construct an index of like how like on the suitability to grow cereals versus to grow roots and tubers, and we find that the differences in fertility across a system of inheritance are only being displayed in places where land intensity is larger. Okay. So how much time do I have? Maybe
Another 5 or 6 minutes.
5 or 6 minutes. So basically, I hope I convinced you that inheritance rules can affect fertility decisions. I'm pretty convinced, but it's also important to know in which context. It's not in any context. This is we're talking about mostly agriculture type of economies, small farmer types, not like a big landowner. These are all small farmer types of economies that we're talking about. So it's agriculture and small farmers, which are kind of like constrained by, like the most likely to be constrained by such an indivisibility constraints in terms of land. Okay. So about marriage, maybe 2 words. So I look at, so this is a paper with Matt Curtis, Marconi, and Joan Haddad. Matt and Joan were, Matt was a PhD postdoc with me, and Joan is still a postdoc here at ECARES. And so what we look is whether these inheritance customs can explain the European marriage pattern. I don't know if you're aware of these institutions, but it has been documented that one of the pillars of Europe's development in early modern times, and it was characterized by late marriage and high celibacy. So although we know that these institutions was beneficial for development, we know very little about its origins. And here that's what we want to investigate. And many sociologists would say that there is indeed an iron chain between inheritance and marriage, but we don't really know how. And the how can go both ways. So if I have an inheritance, maybe that would kind of like restrict some financial constraints, and that would allow me to get into a marriage. That's what we will call, so like in terms of context of high celibacy, this is what we will call constrained celibacy. So those women that do not have access to inheritance, nobody wants them in the marriage market, and they're constrained to be single. Now, you can also think there, and that's both true in conceptually, but also in the literature, the kind of like papers like fighting against one or the other type of celibacy that we observe in the European marriage pattern. And the other one is that if I am a woman who can work, and on top of that, I receive an inheritance, that's what we can call empowered celibate. Now, with the inheritance, I can choose whether I can work more or pick a better spouse, and that would ultimately lead me to remain celibate. And that's very kind of like this conceptual way of thinking about inheritance and decisions to enter or not the marriage is something that we see also nowadays. If you plot marriage, a probability to marry with education or wealth, you do see this hump-shaped pattern of about marriage decisions. So basically, not to go to the details, but just to tell you the results, we find evidence for both. We do find that in places where women had no labor market opportunities, proxied in different ways, then access to inheritance will allow them to enter into marriage. While in places where they had a good labor market environment for them, then inheritance would allow them to remain single. So we find evidence for both types of arguments. And now let me conclude with what Michael wanted me to say, and I postponed it until the last minute. But so what, you know? And so here we will. So this is a very early stage project that we were working on with Guillaume Chapelle, who is in Cergy at Paris, and Gerard Domenech Arumi, who's on the market, and he's amazing now visiting Berkeley. So I think you should definitely look forward to him. And so basically, so these are exploration facts. So okay, what is the legacy of these inheritance rules? And we can look at education, land use, and some housing type of outcomes. Okay. So this is for education, and it plots for the 19th century, the share of people signing marriage contracts. Okay, so this is a proxy for education before education becomes really universal. And we do see differences. We do see that in partible inheritance, people were more educated than in partible inheritance. I think this is a pretty robust result. If you look at 18th century with the Louis Henry database that also has information on marriage signatures, then you do see a very similar pattern. So here I'm splitting for men and for women in rural towns. So you do see the same. If you'll go for cities, you'd see the same, both for men and for women. For men, it starts closing at the end of the 18th century. So that's the first thing. But then, in the 19th century, if you distinguish in these, I haven't introduced this database, which is amazing, which is the TRA database. If you don't know, we can talk about it, but it's a very nice database on, they select people based on their names, and these names were supposed to start with TRA, and they create a database based on the records that these people leave when they die. So it's very good to study successions type of things. Okay, so basically, if you look at men and women in the 19th century, you'd only find differences for women. Men had already converged right after the 19th century, after the end of the 18th century. Okay, so there are things going on for education. So let me go directly to education. If this is these are RDDs at the municipality level using our border discontinuity, putting a segment fixed effects, not to compare the south with the norms, but if you look at outcomes from households head, we still find today that places that were partible in the past have today higher education too. So we don't see, of course, the ability to sign a marriage contract, but the probability to have a high school degree is still present today. Same for employment. We don't see anything in household size. We don't see anything in fertility. So fertility did converge. I think something that is very persistent is the land use. And that's related to, of course, these inheritance are there for a reason, and this reason has remained. And therefore, if you look at land use, we do see that under partible inheritance, there's a lower probability that the land is used in agriculture productive activities. Okay, so that's something that is, I think, quite reasonable, and we still find it today. And then housing, the numbers of rooms, the space, the dwellings are smaller under partible inheritance. They're very smaller, in particular at the bottom of the distribution, and that's why we find a Gini coefficient that is higher under partible inheritance. We don't find any difference on the home ownership rate. Okay, so there are some differences. Some have shrinked over time, some orders, and the ones that haven't shrinked, I think there is a logic, and that's very much related to geography. So that's it. I'm gonna stop here.
Okay. That was, I think, was my pause, yeah. All right. Well, you covered a lot of material there, so I'm sure you're going to get a lot of questions. Chin, we've got a question here, please, and then.
So Paula, in terms of just organizing my thoughts, it seemed like there was the inheritance laws are due to some underlying factors, let's say land and agriculture, all that. So if I were thinking of that as a first stage, and then there's some outcomes, right? So should I think about the reduced form, or do you want to sort of interpret this as like an IV where land use is an instrument for inheritance rules? Are we comfortable with that, or do we sort of want to think about maybe land use is sort of the underlying factor that drives everything? If you didn't think that there was like an exclusion restriction, right?
Yeah, so that's why I think that the correct identification strategy is to go to spatial RDD, because that's where we think that these geographical variables should be smooth at the border of institutional type of differences. Right? Because otherwise geographical factors affect so many institutions at the end of the day that it wouldn't be a good idea. No?
Right. So look, in the long run, like the Africa example, I was confused by that. But like the France example, where there was clearly a change in the laws, I think that's that would be sort of like the other things are held constant, but some of the inheritance rules change.
Yes. So we don't have that for Africa.
Yeah, those are different experiments.
Yeah,
right?
so we have a bunch of balance tables for Africa, and that's where the fight will be, I guess.
Does it work? Paula, this is absolutely fascinating, you know, and really impressive. I have, so maybe, you know, one comment and then one question. It seems that your second prediction about, you know, labor intensive would work very well for China, because China has always had, you know, bigger land yields compared to many other countries historically. And you know, I mean, doing sort of cross-country comparisons would be interesting, even though it's not as fine-grained as what you have done. Then my question is, when you look at Africa, one factor that may play a role is actually the kinship system. So in Europe, kinship system doesn't really vary because it's mostly bilineal, so it's households who make the fertility decisions. But in Africa, in places where you have, you know, a unilineal kinship system, there, you know, it's not clear who makes the fertility decisions, because you know, everything is controlled by the clan, and it's also communal property, is, you know, clan-based, etc. And so that's something that you may want to look at on top of what you've been doing, which is, you know, for Europe it works very well, but I think for other regions you need to integrate the kinship.
Yes, I
variable.
totally agree, and we're exploring that right the moment. If you want, we can talk more, but like it's something, it's a big milestone that we are trying to understand better for the moment. Yes.
Any other questions? Okay. We've got the final academic presentation, and we're very fortunate to have Luigi Pisciferi from Stanford University, who is going to talk about assorted mating and wealth.
Okay. So thanks to the organizer for asking me to do this. This is based on joint work with Andrea Spagling and Luigi Guiso, and is about how the marriage market and has some effects on wealth inequality. So let's see if I make it work. Okay. As you probably know, there's been a lot of discussion about the increase or the fact that there is a lot of concentration of wealth. And this is true for many countries. So the US is the country almost at the top of the table, where the top 1% owns about 35%, if not more, national wealth. So Belgium is a little bit at the bottom of the table, and Norway, which is the country that I'm going to be focusing on, is kind of the top half. And besides the fact that there is a very long, thick tail in the wealth distribution, another important fact is that there has been a pretty rapid increase in the top wealth share, based on the work of Gabriel and others. Now, if you look at there is a kind of an active work in, especially in macro, try to understand what can explain the big concentration of wealth we see in the data. If you take traditional explanation for why people save, these explanations are not really very successful in replicating all the features of the wealth distribution. For example, if you think that people save a lot traditionally for precautionary reasons or for life cycle, this really cannot explain a huge amount of concentration in wealth, because as you become richer and richer, the incentive to save against for precautionary reasons kind of fades out. You need something like non-homothetic preferences, like, you know, luxury goods in the form of bequest, maybe a way of explaining, or you need heterogeneity in discount rates, so the most patient people in the economy are the ones who do all the saving, or things of that sort. So things that we don't really measure. There is a recent literature that has kind of shifted the focus from heterogeneity in return to labor to heterogeneity in return to capital. And in particular, they suggest that there are features in the distribution of returns to wealth that may be playing an instrumental role in explaining a lot of concentration in wealth. And in particular, they point out to two features of the distribution of returns. One is type dependence, which means that people differ persistently in the returns they can generate on their wealth. And, you know, if you have someone who persistently has high returns and someone else who has persistently low returns relative to the average, can be a pretty, over the life cycle of an individual, can be a pretty powerful force in generating inequality in wealth. And if you couple that with the other features that people in this literature point out as being important, scale dependence, so the fact that people at the top of the distribution typically tend to generate higher returns on their wealth, that's an even more amplifying force for explaining wealth inequality. We have some recent work based on the same data that I'm going to use, where we show that these features of the distribution returns are actually confirmed. There is massive returns heterogeneity. There is more than, you know, you could imagine being explained by traditional models in household finance. There is a lot of persistence in returns, so people, and this is true both within person across generations. So people tend to have persistently higher returns or lower returns relative to the average. And there is a strong correlation with wealth. This is true not only across the board, but it's also true on an asset-specific basis. It's true for people investing in risky assets, people investing even in certificates of deposits or saving accounts. And this is not a peculiar feature of Norway. It exists. It's been replicated in many countries, in Sweden, Italy, US, and so forth. Now, what we're trying to do in this paper is to try to understand how features of the marriage market and how people marry can contribute to the debate about wealth inequality. And there are two types of assorted mating, so who marries whom, that we are going to focus on. The first is assorted mating on wealth. So the fact that wealthy people marry wealthy people. This can be decomposed into aspects. So the first is a kind of static effect, which is just the fact that if you have societies in which there is more assorted mating, the wealthy marries wealthy people, you're just going to have more inequality at the point of marriage than society in which there is random assorted mating. Now, this is not an unknown channel. It's been remarked in most of the literature. Is the novel twist we're going to look at because of the type of data we have. We're going to look at assorted mating on personal wealth rather than the wealth of the parents, which is typically what is being documented in the literature. There's also a dynamic effect that plays through the return heterogeneity channel. So if it's true that persistent return heterogeneity is a kind of amplifies the dispersion in wealth, well, this is going to be magnified by the fact that people assort on wealth simply because there's a scale effect. If wealthy people marry wealthy people, there is larger scale on which the same return can actually exercise its power. The other type of assorted mating on that we are going to focus on is assorted mating on the returns to wealth. So somehow it's, this is the composition between assorting on the level and assorting on the growth rate of wealth, because that's what returns are. It's the capacity of growing an initial stock of wealth. This is a channel that has been ignored so far in the literature, but if you believe that heterogeneity in returns, persistent heterogeneity in returns is an important force for wealth inequality, then we may wonder if this other form of assorted mating can also be a further amplifying factor. And returns to wealth, or assorted mating returns to wealth, is going to play out mostly dynamically because, well, the budget constraint is going to, that's where it's going to play a major role. And what we show is that if you think about the transition from an economy where everybody is a single to an economy which people marry, there's actually going to be a shrinkage on the extent of return heterogeneity, simply because it's an application of the law of the central limit theorem. So if you take the return as a couple as being a sort of weighted average of the return of single people, where you're going to have a shrinkage of the extent of heterogeneity, unless you have assorted mating on returns, perfect assorted mating returns. Because in this case, you're just going to have cloning the economy from a distribution of single to the distribution of couple. So couples is just going to be like clones of the singles.
All their wealth, and then the return should be, correlation should be 1.
You will see. Yeah, you will see. Yeah, I'm going to talk about it. Yes.
Out of curiosity, why is it not obvious to add here a third bullet point saying a sort of matching on education? Because if you have two high educated people, they can take more risks. If something goes wrong with one earner, the other one can compensate. So
yes,
why is it so obvious to say we jump to returns to wealth instead of saying something observable like education?
Oh, so I'm going to argue that this type of assorted mating exists on top of the assorted mating on education. So you're going to see that even if I look at narrow groups of individuals have the same level of education, you're still going to see assorted mating on wealth and on returns. Yes.
Skills, and that encapsulates returns to wealth as well. It's just that I know I have a better feeling on what to do.
Yeah.
No matter my.
That's there too. So. Yeah. So we're going to look at assorted mating on preferences for risk, which is one reason why you may see assorted mating on returns. People just have similar preferences for risk or tolerance for risk, and that's why you see assorted mating. And there's going to be also another motivation. I'm going to provide some evidence on this other motivation, which is trying to preserve whatever wealth is merged at wealth is going to be important because of the second channel, the specialization portfolio choice. If you have specialization portfolio choice, you don't really need assorted mating or returns. But if there is some, shared way of making financial decision, once a couple merges its wealth, then assorted mating or returns may be a way of rationalizing what you observe in the data. Yeah.
So that is conditional on mating, right? So you have selection into mating or remaining single. How does that affect the results?
Well, the people we're going to study are basically people that marry, because we don't observe the single that don't get married. I mean, we do observe them, but they're not going to tell us anything about patterns of assorted mating. Yeah. Okay, so I want to show you first an illustrative example, and then I'm going to go through some data definition, and then I'm going to document the type of assorted mating we have. Okay, so the illustrative example is the following. Suppose that people, when married, they merge their wealth as a single person. So the wealth of a couple is the sum of the wealth of the man and the woman. And you can think of measuring assorted mating of wealth just with the correlation coefficients, these rho W. So you can imagine, at least the two star cases that have been studied in the literature are these two, well, not really polar, because the other pole is -1, but there is the case of random matching, in which the correlation is 0, or the case of perfectly positive assorted mating on wealth, in which, if you rank men and women, then the top ranked woman marry the top ranked man, and so on and so forth. Negative sorting is also possible. If you, at least in popular culture, there's a lot of examples of, Cinderella and Pretty Women, Jack Dawson, if you remember the movie Titanic, Barry Lyndon, etc. And There isn't a lot of evidence about it, but at least it's possible. I'm going to show you some interesting patterns that we see in the data regarding this negative sorting. Now, suppose we measure inequality with the coefficient of variation squared. Why do I pick this? It's because it's scale invariant and it has a number of nice properties. So it's the scale invariance is shared by top shares measures, is shared by the Gini coefficient. And the advantage of this guy is that it's decomposable, so you can do algebra with it. So this is the only reason why I'm using this. So the decomposability property is visible in the second equations because you can show that the wealth inequality, so this measure psi for the couple, is a combination of the wealth of the single men and the single women, plus an element that reflects assorted mating. So the rho W is a direct measure of the contribution of assorted mating on wealth inequality once people merge. It also depends on this factor omega, which is the contribution of partners, in this case, the man or the husband, to the wealth of the couple. So there are two general observations you can take by just staring at this simple expression. The first is that because the mean is actually growing faster than the variance, so the denominator is growing faster than the numerator, marriage actually shrinks wealth inequality. So if you are moving towards a society in which fewer people marry or more people stay single for longer, you actually naturally are going to have an increase in wealth inequality if you measure inequality with the wealth of the household, and there are single and married households. Simply because when people marry, a little bit of the tail of the distribution gets cut because you merge the wealth of the single people. That's the first observation. The second observation is a comparative static relative to the contribution of assorted mating. So society in which the rho coefficient is higher, so there is more assorted mating, are going to be more unequal at the point of marriage than society in which you have random mating. That's a kind of an obvious consequence of the third term in that equation. So this is at the point of marriage. What about the dynamics? Well, here's where return heterogeneity matters. So you can ask, okay, how inequality is going to evolve during the life cycle of a cohort, of a marriage cohort in this case. And if everyone has the same returns, then the scale invariance of this index and of the Gini, of the top shares, etc., will imply that the only thing that matters is really initial conditions, but then inequality in wealth is not going to change because everyone enjoys the same return. So the wealth is going to grow at the same rate for everyone. So whatever inequality there is at the beginning of the marriage will remain unchanged. So you need to inject something that makes growth unequal in order to generate inequality over the life cycle of a cohort. If you don't have inequality, for example, in active saving, which in this case I'm not considering. So suppose you introduce heterogeneity returns in the following sense. The rate of return on assets of a couple is some weighted average of the return of the person who has the best return of the two in the pre-marriage period, and the 1 minus Q is the weight that is assigned to the person who has the lowest return. So you weight indifferently people with higher ability to generate returns, so to grow the wealth, and the lowest ability. Okay. So what these weights are going to be, maybe bargaining, can be specialization. You can be a democratic society in which Q is 0.5 and so forth. And if you want to measure instead, in this case, the correlation, the assorted mating returns, you can use similarly the correlation coefficients between the returns, the pre-marriage return of the man and the woman. You can show, and I don't have in this case the slides, but you can show that there are two interesting things going on from looking at this particular way of thinking about return heterogeneity. The first is that here too you have a shrinkage of return heterogeneity, so less contribution to wealth inequality or declining wealth inequality when you move from a distribution of single households to a distribution of couples. And here is even more evident because in this case, you have this shrinkage coming from an application of the law of large numbers. The variance of an average is always less than the variance of an IID return. So the only case in which you have a preservation of inequality is when there is perfect assorted mating of returns. Yes.
Small clarification. So the Q is the same for the whole society, for everyone?
It doesn't need to be. So you may have, in fact, you will see there is heterogeneity.
RM
there.
and RF is also not the same for every man and woman in the society.
No.
Okay.
So both types of heterogeneity by gender, and when you have larger weight placed on people with a high return will depend, for example, the position, the wealth distribution. If there is a lot of wealth, okay, you're going to have actually less democratic allocation of power. Yeah, exactly. Now, the second thing that can happen, and this is something that is very specific to portfolio choices. So once you merge the wealth, you have to decide how to allocate this wealth. So, and if you have a form of specialization that is not very different from, specialization you have in a Beckerian environment, you can have cases in which the person who is best equipped to manage a portfolio is going to be totally in charge. Okay. Or you can have, more democratic allocation of financial management powers. You have, 50-50, et cetera, et cetera. But the return heterogeneity is going to actually shrink if couples specialize. And simply because here too, you have a cut of the tail, in particular the lower tail. So the mean, if the mean person doesn't really have if the specialization means the max person, the person with the max return is going to be in charge, then you cut in the lower tail from the distribution of singles. So you're going to have a shrinkage of the distribution returns. So that is another reason to expect when you move from thinking about single houses to thinking about marriage couples to have a shrinkage of return heterogeneity and actually a negative impact on wealth inequality. Okay. So if you want to have the comparative study, this is what can happen. So on this graph, I'm plotting the wealth inequality, the extent of return heterogeneity against the degree of assorted mating returns. It's only when you clone the singles that you can actually have the same extent of heterogeneity in returns that you have among singles replicated in the distribution of couples. It's just the population principle applied. And here instead, I'm plotting how the extent of return heterogeneity changes with the weight assigned to the max person. For realistic values, where you assign at least 50%, you're going to have, again, a shrinkage of return heterogeneity. And, it can be substantial. The scale is not helping here, but it can be substantial decrease in the case where there is specialization. And notice that if you have negative assorted mating returns, which is not absurd cases, because, you can have a way of diversifying somehow the way people match, you can actually have return heterogeneity shrinking almost to zero because, the highest return person marries the lowest return. And so you have essentially almost no heterogeneity left once you do that. But of course, this is an extreme case. So once you put these two things together, you're thinking about dynamics in wealth and you have return heterogeneity. The return heterogeneity after one period that the couple is married will grow over time because of the extent of return heterogeneity and then this interaction term that comes from this channel that I've tried to put together. So both the form of specialization you have in portfolio choices, the extent of assorted mating on returns and on wealth, and so forth. Okay, so the paper is mostly about trying to document how important these different forces are. So the paper uses this data. It's a bunch of administrative archives for Norway, 2005, 2015. They contain information on tax records, and tax records in the Norwegian case include not only information on income from labor and from capital, but also information on wealth, because the Norwegians pay a tax on wealth. And the information that the tax authority collects on wealth is both assets and liabilities, and assets are measured in a quasi-broad sense. There is information on different types of safe assets, different types of risky assets, and housing, and the value of private businesses. And the value of private businesses comes from reports that companies submit to the tax authority for the purpose of for the tax. There's also information on housing that comes from a housing transaction register that collects information on when the house is sold, what's the price at which it's sold, etc. And to fill in the gaps in the years in which there are no transaction, we use a sort of machine learning algorithm. Think of Zillow for those of you who are familiar with that. And the shareholder registry includes information on each security that Norwegians own. So if you own shares of Apples, I know exactly the number of shares that you own. I know the prices, so I can compute essentially without error the capital gains on that particular security. So there are several advantages from using this administrative data. It's based on third-party reports. So in Norway, many people just do not fill in a tax record, a tax report to the authority. All the information on income and capital comes from third party, comes from the employer, comes from the bank, from the stockbroker, the insurance company, etc. Very few pieces of information actually submitted directly by the individual. There's limited scope for tax evasion. It doesn't mean that there isn't tax evasion. There is some evidence from work by Gabriel and others that, especially at the top, there is more hidden wealth, especially abroad. There's universal coverage, no attrition, apart from death and migration. We observe everyone in this data set, including the wealthiest man in Norway, who is this guy, okay, who owns this hotel and the chairs in which you're sitting.
But when you say there's no attrition, what happens if they separate?
They separate from what?
The couple divorce.
You keep following them when they're single.
That's all I'm saying, okay.
Yeah, yeah. No, I meant separation just at the population level. Yeah. There's long panel data and family ID allow you to match parents with kids, but also people before they get married. So this is the real advantage if you want to study the certainty mating, because in most of the data set you can think of, you observe people when they're already married. So you don't know how much wealth they were contributing to the marriage, because you already observe a case in which they have already merged whatever wealth they have.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
Hang on a second.
What about marriage contracts? I mean, you seem to assume that throughout that we marry and we merge for wealth.
Yes.
I only know one couple, wealthy. They're not Norwegian, they're Germans. I mean, they are really wealthy. They have not merged their wealth. They run separate. They each have a firm, family firm, because each the wealth is family and all those things, but they have nothing to do. Everything that they do, those people, you go with them in a restaurant, they pay separately. Everything is separate. There's nothing merged.
That's good. So two comments. The first, actually three comments. The first is that if that was a generalized thing, in fact, you would have to think about more wealth inequality, precisely because single, actually in a population of single houses, and this would basically be treated as single houses in your example, there would be more inequality among married couples because they don't merge. The second is that we don't really measure individual contribution to wealth. In data, administrative data, in survey data, we always observe wealth at the household level. We never try to decompose that. The third is that what you're saying is totally interesting and important, because there is some evidence that more recent generations actually tend to have more separate accounts than old generation. So it's possible that the model for the future would be one in which people because of different participation, labor market, etc., do keep the accounts separated and they don't merge. I would say the norm is still to merge. If anything, because many countries, when you do get married, assume that the default is actually that you merge the wealth. And the rules for assigning wealth at the point of divorce is still equitable. So they don't actually, a lot of states in the US, for example, assume that there is equitable participation to the business, to the affairs of the household, and actually split the assets at the point of divorce equally. with some exception among states. Okay, but this is a useful comment. Okay, so I'm gonna skip the limitations for the interest of time. So just to return to the definition. So we're gonna look at a measure of wealth, which is net worth. So it's the sum of financial wealth, the value of housing, and the value of private businesses that people own, minus the liabilities. And the return is just gonna take the information we have on capital income and the accrued, realized, and unrealized capital gains. So this is not just gonna be realized, it's gonna include the unrealized capital gains because we have access to the shareholder registry. It's going to subtract the interest paid on loans. It's going to divide by the gross wealth at the beginning of the period. We don't divide by net worth to avoid having, people with negative net worth being assigned a positive return. And we have, discussion on how we adjust this for the fact that people may contribute actually some saving during the period, which may inflate or deflate the numerator. And this is the disadjustment. The sample selection includes individual, and there are some questions about, includes individual that got married or started cohabiting while sharing custody of a child. So there are two ways you can be observed. You can be classified as married in Norway for tax purposes. The first, you have a formal contract of marriage. The second, you cohabit and share the custody of a child, okay? You will be treated for tax purposes as married. There are strong incentives to actually formalize a marriage contract because of the tax wealth, giving an allowance of $1 million Norwegian krona becomes 2 million if you're married. Okay, so for many people in this range, it is very advantageous for tax purposes to report being married, or at least to formalize a union. This is going to include both first and subsequent marriages. And again, we observe the wealth at the point of marriage and then the merged wealth afterwards. Individual return to wealth, which is something that we use, is an average computed over the years that precede marriage to capture the persistent component. And one issue we may have is that if people start sharing resources before we observe them formally into a marriage, there might be, a kind of spurious formal assorted mating. The wealth is going to be correlated because it's exactly the same wealth. So we're going to drop the 4 years that precede the first time we observe these people married. And to avoid even further contamination, if you don't believe that, we're going to look at people who actually don't live together 4 years before marriage. So they live in different counties, and you're going to see the results are basically identical. So speaking of Olav Thon, Norway has a tradition of being very transparent in tax records. Starting in I think in the early 1800s, you could go to, the buildings of the tax authority, get a big book and actually see the tax returns of Norwegians. And then the government in 2001 digitalized that. So starting in 2001, if you had an internet access, you could enter the name of Norwegian taxpayers and get this information. So Olav Thon, who is this guy here, this is his tax record for, I don't remember which year. So you can see his income, you can see his wealth, the taxes he paid, the year in which he was born, where he's living, etc. So they cannot even lie on their age. So it means that, if you wanted to collect some information on potential spouses, well, there is, this mechanism. So the funny thing is that there was an incredible large volume of searches starting in 2001. And so the government tried to curb a little bit that. So in 2011, I think, they introduced a system that you needed a username and a password in order to get the search. And then because this didn't really slow down things, they introduced a rule that if you search for Frank will know that you searched him, okay? And that basically eliminated the problem. Okay, so the key statistics. Norwegians marry relatively late relative to, for example, Americans. So the median age for women is 29, for men is 32. If you want a comparison for the US, would be like 27 and 30. Most of them are in their first marriage. Their years of schooling is around between 13 and 14. they're mostly, a lot of them are Oslo residents, and despite, 4 years before marriage, a good chunk of them already have some ownership of houses, for example. You have a question?
So I waited 10 minutes, but Michael is not asking the question. But if you do this exercise in Belgium, you would see that Mr. Ton would not report a lot of income because it would all be in his private company. So is that an issue in Norway as well, that from the wealthy people, it's very hard to know their return because they have companies and it's not really linked to your data? Or that's
The
not
return
all?
to capital?
So here in Belgium, if you have a company, you could say all returns of my company, it stays separate. It's a separate entity. So it would declare taxes as a separate entity as well.
But
So
we do
all-
observe information on the private businesses. So we observe the balance sheets of the private. So we know, for example, if they are retained earnings in their
But
company.
it's not linked to Mr.
Yes,
Ton.
it is. Because the shareholder registry includes information not only the private securities, publicly listed companies, but also the shares you own of the public companies. And in fact, it's an interesting matrix algebra problem, because if I own a company, that company may own shares of another company, you need to solve the problem of looping. And we did that. So we have this looping where, we control for the fact that, Mr. Ton can have a lot of Chinese boxes, so that the looping has been taken care of. Okay, so I have 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Okay, so I'm gonna skip this. I'm gonna show you some evidence on a sorting meeting. I'm gonna show you first the heat maps and then some bin-scar and then regressions. So the heat map is a way of visualizing who marries whom. So this is ranking men 4 years before they get married according to the ventile of their wealth. So there are 5 percentage points each. And you do the same for the distribution of women. And then you count the number of marriages. So you see softer colors, it's more marriages. So the largest number of marriages is exactly at the top. So because there is a lot of marriages along this diagonal, that's evidence of assorted mating effectively. And the darker areas means you see fewer marriages. So a lot of assorted mating and also some crossing evidence. So if you look at the wealthiest woman, she's very likely to marry a wealthy man, but she's actually more likely to marry someone at the very bottom of the distribution and someone in the middle of the distribution. And the same is true for men, actually. So you do see a little bit of non-monotonicity in marriage patterns. So, some Cinderella stories do exist, but of course, they are completely dwarfed, dominated by a lot of assorted mating in this part of the distribution. The bin-scar tell you the same story. In this case, you're ranking men according to the percentile of their wealth and measuring the average wealth percentile of the woman. So you can see some negative sorting here because you're looking at, this is a picture of people with negative net worth, so people in debt. They don't marry people in debt, okay? So there is negative sorting there. And you see an acceleration of assorted mating. So there's some nonlinearity. If you were to, measuring the correlation here would be like 0.7 instead of 0.2, okay? So it's not Downton Abbey, clearly, because it's a little bit more democratic than that, but it's not Pretty Woman either. So it's something in between. It's not actually, there was this question about education. So if you look at people who have both college education, okay, and you re-rank people in this particular range, so people with high education, you see actually the same evidence of assorted mating on wealth, if anything, even more assorted mating on wealth. So you can see, the example I always give is at Stanford, we have Bill Gates' daughter and Rupert Murdoch's son. So they're more likely to marry between the two of them that, each one of them with a low-income kid from the population of students at Stanford. That's the kind of thing you want to have in mind. Parents is the extra thing you want to think about. So, of course, a lot of the wealth may be inherited. In fact, we show that this assorted mating we see in the data is not due to that, because if you look at kids whose parents are still alive, all of them, all 4 of them, on his side and her side, you see the same amount of assorted mating. So in that case, it must be assorted mating in personal wealth exclusively. But even if you do assorted mating on your personal wealth plus the expected value of the inheritance, which is calculated by just taking current wealth of the parents and dividing among the siblings. So you take just a share. The evidence is pretty similar. There is a channel, of course, there's an intergenerational transmission of wealth that you want to take into account, together with, is this really like a, window dressing for a certain mating on the parental wealth? So you can do, the first thing you can do is first see at a certain mating, this is now regression, so it's controlling for a lot of things at the same time. There is a certain mating on wealth of the parents, but the assorted mating on personal wealth is actually stronger. And if you put the two together, the assorted mating on parents gets killed. Okay, it's mostly assorted mating on personal wealth, which is the blue. The one on parents basically goes away. Yeah.
So I don't know about this heterogeneity in returns, but one of the things that you learn from your parents is like good investment opportunities, or you might be getting that. So how does that?
Yes,
Where
it's coming.
is that in terms
It's
of?
coming. It's coming. I'm going to show you the results. Yes, you do learn some, but it's easier for parents to transmit wealth than the ability to grow your wealth. So you will see that the coefficient actually is lower for the returns than for the wealth. Yes.
Can you explain a little bit what is the children's wealth versus the parents' wealth? I mean,
the personal wealth is
people marry on average. You said 32 for men, I think 29 for women, right? So I don't know exactly at what age you're observing them, obviously, but at 29, I have my parents' wealth, right? I don't have any wealth of my own except what I've inherited. So I'm not too sure I understand what is parents' wealth here and what is children's wealth.
The parents' wealth is the wealth of your parents, and
yes, but again, I mean, how do you distinguish here?
They're two different people.
No, sure, but say, I don't know at what age. I mean, if I observe somebody at the age of 65, I've had the time to accumulate wealth. If you observe me at 30, I've not had any chance to accumulate except what I've inherited from my parents. So the age at which you are observing people here must matter a great deal about this issue of parents versus.
Okay, there are main responses. I don't have a lot of time, so I want to be. So these include subsequent marriages. So there are people who are 65 when they marry. Okay, so they have exactly the more wealth accumulated you have in mind. If you exclude these guys, it doesn't matter. So the degree of assorted mating on personal wealth excluded the subsequent marriages, very similar. The second thing that I can say is that if you include in the sample only people whose parents are still alive, therefore they have not received any bequests, the assorted mating on personal wealth is still there. So the results don't change that. So if you want to have some descriptive statistics, net worth 4 years before marriage, this is what it is. So the average is $87,000, $103,000. This is including everyone. So including those who marry at 65, at 29, etc. So it's not that they are, a lot of them don't have any wealth. So if you look at the median, of course, there is a distribution, with the median being much less than the average. So young people at the point of marriage reproduce the same type of inequality that exists in the population at large. It's just much reduced. If you look at parents, yes, they are, at a much later stage of their life cycle, of course, they have more wealth. Okay, so.
Yeah, can I suggest it? Why don't you just take 5 minutes to finish, right? And then we'll take questions at the end. So that why don't you just be uninterrupted till you finish, if that's okay.
So the intergenerational channel, you see it, it's the green line. So assorted mating returns to wealth is the other dimension I wanted to discuss. You see the same kind of heat map reproduces. So this is something that is not been documented before. So there are assorted mating not only on wealth, but also on the growth rate of wealth, so on the return, so on the ability to grow. And in fact, if you look at the bit scatter, has the same slope, 0.18 versus 0.19. And, you could say, well, if there is scale dependence, so if wealthy people have high returns, that may be the reason. But if you look at people who are in the top quartile of the wealth distribution, so top quartile woman and top quartile men, so rich man, rich woman, actually you see even more assorted mating of returns. And perhaps this is not surprising because that's where it matters, okay? That's where when you have a lot of money, that actually matters who you marry in terms of returns, because, well, that's the story that's gonna come up. This reproduces the same type of regression, tries to establish that, you know, as Gino was asking, you may wonder, well, is it coming from the parents transmitting the ability? Yes, some, but it's much less than the ability to actually transmit wealth. The coefficient is significant, but it's fairly small. And again, it's not assorted mating on the parental component, but on personal returns, you know, however they are generated. So where this assorted mating return is coming from? It is, as someone was asking, clearly related to traits, preferences for risk. If you look at the composition of the portfolio in the years before they get married and classify people according to the amount of risk that they take, so risky share in their portfolio, women with high risk share marry men with a risky share in their portfolio, okay? So that is one fact. The other fact is, suppose you have, you know, in mind the idea of wanting to preserve the wealth that is merged, okay? And here you will need to know Downton Abbey, because I'm going to use the analogy of Lady Mary. She will marry some rich guy. It's Victorian society. Well, it's actually a little bit late Victorian. She will marry some rich guy, but then let's say she has a choice between a high return potential spouse and a low return potential spouse. And if you know the soap opera, you know who I'm talking about. So who should she marry if she has the choice between a low R and a high R person? Well, the answer is going to depend on whether she's going to be in charge, okay? If the person with a high return will remain in charge of the portfolio of the merged household, then it doesn't matter if she marries the low R and the high R. If she marries the low R is going to be, you know, given an allowance and, you know, not a mess with the family affairs. But if the low R person has a lot of say, okay, especially if there, you know, there are gender norms or things of that sort, then you do want to assort on returns to avoid having, you know, a decline in your personal wealth and decline in family wealth once it's merged. So this is basically a test that we conduct. We basically test whether the influence of the person who has the highest return in the pre-marriage period is higher than the influence on the post-marriage return of the person who has the minimal return or the lowest return. And if there is wealth preservation motive for assorting returns, you should see the mean and the max mattering. If there is specialization, you should see only the max mattering, etc. So this nests a number of hypotheses. And this is the last slide that I'm going to have. You see here that the max has a larger weight than the mean. So there is some form of efficiency in portfolio choices. The weight that is assigned to the max person is 80%. Now, if you look at men that has the lower return tend to have a larger weight than would be warranted by, you know, how good he is. So there are some gender norms in portfolio choices. So he seemed to want a larger weight no matter how good or bad he is. And if you look at the same weights separating between very wealthy households and not so wealthy households, so households in which there is at least one spouse in the top 10% of the distribution, then in this case, the weights are 100% to the max among wealthy households and 0 for the mean. So if you wanted to have a way for explaining endogeneity of returns and its contribution to wealth inequality, this is it. Okay, the households in which there is a lot of money, okay, wealth is higher, you have higher returns because you assign all the weight to the person with the max. You get the financial management of the affairs of the households in the hands of the person who is best equipped to grow the wealth. Okay.
Right. Thank you. All right. So we have time for a couple of questions.
Yes, hello, very interesting. I just had a small question. Does the family, the wealth of the parents not matter indirectly in the sense that wealthy families would, for example, transfer money for buying a house for their children, or they would, for example, pay the rent of their children for their apartments, and in this way help the accumulation of wealth of their children to make it faster.
They do, absolutely. So we have another paper in which we look at actually transfers, in vivo transfers, and how these in vivo transfers are used to smooth shocks that the kids face. But I want to say, there's a lot of question on parent contribution. This is not the issue. Of course, a lot of the wealth of individuals are due to the wealth of the parents. But the question is, independent of whether you have contribution from the parents or not, do people assort on wealth? That's the question. The question whether you see assort in mating, whether it's coming from money coming from the parents, from other sources like personal abilities, etc. That is an important question, but the question is really, do we see assort in mating? Whatever, sources wealth is coming from. Okay, parents are important, but it's still, the question of the paper is really, do we see assort in mating?
I have a clarifying question about how you measure returns.
Yeah.
It's André's question that made me wonder about that. So I marry at 30.
Mhm.
I did not inherit from my parents. And then over time, they donate money. So you will see my assets growing. Is it influencing the way you measure the returns on my investments?
So only to the extent that these assets or these transfers may happen in the middle of the year, and then I don't have a good adjustment for the additional savings. But otherwise, there shouldn't be. Wealth is measured on December 31st of every year, and capital income are the flows that you observe. So if I receive an inheritance, let's say, or a big transfer in the middle of the year, I may be exaggerating the capital income if I was investing the money. So this adjustment of the denominator is trying to account for the fact that some saving was added, some saving was subtracted during the year. So it's trying to, avoid overstating the returns or understating the returns because of net saving flow changing significantly during the year. If some of the net saving flow is coming from the parents, then yeah, this might be an issue. We haven't done in this paper, but we do have a registry of transfers, so we could, easily correct for that, as long as people report, of course, the transfers.
I have a question. So how much is how much of this phenomenon you're observing, explaining, is all generated just by wealthy people? In a sense, what's the median level of wealth? Is it possible that if the median level of wealth is very low for men and women, I mean, if a lot of people have zero wealth, right?
So the median is 6,000 for women and 11,000 for men at the point of marriage.
Yeah. But so how many have zero? How much have zero wealth?
So the bottom 25% have negative net worth.
Okay.
So there is a non-negligible share that have zero. Yeah.
So a lot of this
a lot of people have a lot of debt coming from student debt.
So is it possible that this phenomenon is all explained just by the wealthy marrying the wealthy, and the left-hand tails are basically irrelevant?
Well, you see a certain mating throughout. So it's very large at the top 10%. The slope changes. There's no linearity, but there's assorted mating also in the middle of the distribution. And at the bottom there is this negative assorted mating because people with debt marry people with positive wealth on average.
Right, but the ones in the left-hand tail are not really contributing that much to inequality, right? If I've got nothing and I marry someone who's got nothing, then that's not the same thing as someone who's got, and then 1 and 1 or 2, 2. That's not very much. But if all of a sudden someone's got 1 million and 1 million,
well, they contribute to the extent that they are part of the total, right? So
no, that's right. But their contribution. If I measured inequality by the contribution of the poor marrying the poor, or even the average marrying the average, they could be doing nothing.
It's not going to be that interesting,
right? Yeah.
You wonder about what happens at the very top in the tails, at the top tails, not the bottom. At least that's the typical thing that people study.
All right. Well, thanks very much. We better stop them.